The cathedral bells accused me as if they knew my shame before anyone else. They told with a clarity that felt personal, each chime a headline, and the air between the pews hummed with the small, sharp sounds of whispering forks paused over plates of anticipation at some imagined future. I held Lily's hand so tight my knuckles ached. She didn't yet understand the way adults could turn absence into spectacle. She hummed the tune of a song she'd made up that morning and tugged at the hem of my dress, proud of the way her bow matched the flowers at the altar. I had memorized my lines in the dark of our tiny apartment, practiced a smile that could keep the flutter in my chest from showing. I had rehearsed this as if it were a play where everything went right. Greg did not show. No one announced it. There was a polite, almost surgical silence, long enough for the stained glass to look down and judge. 1,000 imagined reasons, unfurled flat tire, nervous stomach, last-minute panic, and then whispers filled the space where explanations should have been. The priest cleared his throat twice. People shifted. A woman clutched a program like a shield. My stomach dropped and lodged there, heavy and steady as a stone. Was he someone's voice broke off? A brittle question that hung between the organ and the bride's bouquet. When heads turned toward the doors, I expected an apologetic, breathless groom. Instead, a tall man crossed the nave, flanked by 2 men in dark coats like leaning bars of winter. He wore black like punctuation, the hem of his coat moving with a precision I couldn't name. Even from the back of the church I felt the air change. Men parted without being asked. He did not smile. He did not look like a man who belonged at my wedding. He stopped 3 rows from the front and inclined his head as if he were entering someone's drawing room rather than trespassing on my humiliation. The hush stretched until I thought my heart would fold and become one of the pleats in my dress. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice arrived without excess. It had a foreign cadence that made certain consonants feel colder, letters arriving with deliberate weight. I apologize for interrupting your ceremony. The priest blinked, then tried to proceed, but the man's presence had the air of a verdict. A woman in the back gasped. Someone's phone clicked on, the bright aperture of a camera like a greedy eye. He stepped forward, up close. He was not a cartoon of danger. He had the kind of hands the world had learned to obey. Scarred, steady, with a faint, well-kept callus at the base of his thumb. His scent reached me something like wood smoke and cologne, sharp and oddly domestic. His eyes were an incongruous blue, a color that did not match the rest of his austere landscape. "You are Emma Lawson," he said. The name on his tongue felt like proof. "And this is your daughter." He spoke to me as if we were the 2 facts in a ledger. I wanted to say no, that he had mistaken me for someone else, but the congregation had stopped pretending and was watching a different kind of drama. Behind him, his men one a broad-shouldered presence, the other narrow and quick-eyed answered questions the priest did not ask. In a careful, almost perfunctory way, the tall man produced a folded envelope. An attorney's mark. The paper had edges like currency. "He stole from me," the man said finally, and the sound of Grig's name, wrapped in accusation, made the room tilt. "Your fiancé took a large sum. It was not his to take." I understood then. Not the mathematics of the thefty. Never had been able to do quick sums in my head, but the size of the thing. Not a missing ring, not a credit card slip. People's faces drained in the pews. Parents drew children closer. Somewhere in the church a baby began to cry. A high, scandalous sound. "You'll have to forgive me," the man said, and in a voice that could be either condolence or command, he laid out what he expected. He spoke with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the moment 1,000 times in his mind. He proposed a solution as if offering a menu option: settle the debt or face consequences for those connected. To Greg, he named harm in a manner that made it legal and moral warp at once, without describing any instrument of damage. It was enough. My throat closed. Lily looked at me with 2 questions. Why is the church loud now? And why is Daddy not here? I had practiced answers for happy eventualities, not for bargaining with men whose lives were wrapped around transactions I could not begin to understand. "Marry me?" he said simply. Marry him. The phrase felt obscene in all the ways a means could be. The priest's lips were pressed into a line that tried to be neutral and failed. Murmurs rose like a tide. The organist faltered, a clumsy chord spilling forward like a pedal misstep. I remember thinking of the little dent in our sofa where Lily sat every morning, her cereal bowls lined like small planets on the coffee table, the stack of overdue library books because tuition had to be fed instead. I thought of the look Lily gave me when she crawled on my lap and named the people she loved. Mama, Greg, Nana Mags. I thought, sharply, about the debts Greg had created in a silence, and how those debts had the capacity to reach into the lives he left behind. He can't be serious, someone whispered. Melanie's voice, thin with a protectiveness she no longer had the right to wield in public. I felt her presence in my chest, like a second heartbeat. The tall man Alexander Volkov's smiled at Lily in a way that was improbable and disorienting. He leaned down, the motion practiced, and at the first true moment of tenderness I'd seen since the morning became a stage, he offered Lily a small, wrapped box. "For your princess," he said, and Lily took it with the solemnity of a child who recognizes that presents are not always frivolous. My decision did not feel like a decision. It was an arithmetic of fear and care. I thought of Greg's father, who had loaned him money, who would now find himself in other men's ledgers. I thought of friends who might be questioned, of Melanie and Rachel dragged into caravans of suspicion because of association. The choice was not between two lives of equal value. It was between surrender and the possibility that the worst would come for people I loved. "Marry him!" the public murmured, an ugly chorus of pity and conjecture. The phrase sat heavy in the nave-like spilled ink. I put my hand into his. The touch was cool and practiced. The photographer, who had been trying to conceal excitement for the most dramatic turn of the afternoon, finally laughed, a brittle sound, and clicked a sequence of unblinking frames. The priest's hands trembled when he took the rings, the sanctity of the ritual taut as a wire. I gave my vows the way you hand over a small jewel. Carefully, formally, the words memorized and dry. "You are under duress." I wanted to tell the priest, "This is not my choice," but the sound that came out of my mouth was smaller. "I will," I said, and the word filled the room with an immediate, aching responsibility. Lily leaned into me like a small mapped coast. Her breath on my neck smelled like cotton candy and something salt from the sea of children's soup she always insisted on finishing. Later, people would say that I married under duress. They would argue the legalities and whisper the right words to make themselves feel properly outraged. In the moment, it felt like a transaction made public, my life exchanged for safety. Alexander's gaze met mine across the altar and held a ledger closing with a soft click. If you want to see how a night of shame turned into a life-altering bargain, keep watching and subscribe for the full story. The reception that followed was not a celebration. It was an aftershock. Folks scraped plates as if they were responding to a tremor. Conversations resumed with emptying chairs like tied lines. People placed their hands on my shoulder in sympathy, and I learned the geography of pity the way people stood farther away than before. The distance, a new rule enforced. Plates of food were pushed toward me like offerings. A woman I had never spoken to touched Lily's hair and said, "Poor thing," with a practiced softness. Lily, bless her, sampled cake, as if all of the day's logic could be settled by frosting. Alexander moved through the chaos like a man walking through fog he had ordered cleared. His men, discreet and always present, gathered our coats with the attention of Simone, who takes a tray and never forgets the order. No one offered to pay the tab for the reception. The venue manager, a man with the look of someone who had learned to nod at unexpected sums and keep his mouth shut, dissolved into efficiency. Outside, black SUVs lined the drive. The leather in the back seat was cool. Lily slid across it with the tired familiarity children have when they adapt to change, faster than we grant them permission. Alexander sat at the wheel of decisions without being asked. He bent down once to Tina Lily's small hand and let her press her forefinger to his knuckle. He winked at her, and for a moment he was simply a man vying for a child's trust rather than a claimant on my life. "You don't have to sleep there," he said to Lily in a voice that made the words simpler, almost wholly domestic. She chose her purple room before I did. She named it on the drive purple like the dress she'd wanted to wear. She had a way of claiming colors and making them true. Alexander smiled when she announced it, like someone who knew the shapes of promises and wanted to keep their edges soft. The mansion was less a house and more a series of careful decisions broadcast in marble and private hallways. Candles were off lamps. The staff preferred recessed lighting that bent the rooms to softer angles. The place smelled faintly of lemon polish and something older. A scent you only notice when you have to live with it. History, accented with oil. My stomach turned as we were shown to Lily's room. A carousel of stuffed animals sat in a row on a shelf like a soldierly formation. A small desk held educational toys and a stack of books on grammar and numbers. A purple canopy hung above the bed, the fabric catching light and throwing it back like a promise. The staff quiet, efficient, kind in that way that suggested they had been trained in speaking with people who would hurt. Left a stuffed rabbit on the pillow. Lily hugged it as if it were a compass. That night was a lesson in small mercy. Alexander had someone bring in my toiletries from the bag I'd left in my old apartment. He had left a note. You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to be afraid. But you are not to be unsafe. It read like law. It read like mercy. We slept in separate wings. I took the bed that was hers first. The mattress in the guest room felt like a sea that could swallow anxiety whole. I had expected to wake in the morning with a plan to leave, to call Melanie and demand the keys to my life back. Instead, I woke to the quiet sound of Lily reading aloud to her rabbit in the next room, practicing syllables as if making an armor out of language. Early the next morning, a woman with hands that knew the language of kitchens brought tea and an envelope. She was Mrs. Reynolds, the cook, assigned to make us feel small domesticities. She placed the envelope on the table without comment and left a cup that smelled like bergamot and something warm. The envelope was thick and official-looking. My hands shook when I opened it. Inside were documents, a provisional trust, a letter from Mr. Harrington, Alexander's attorney, laying out terms that smelled faintly of legal inevitability. Money for Lily's schooling, a notation about a temporary guardianship, intended to prevent any undue influence or contact that might jeopardize the child's stability. A line about pre-existing debts and how they would be resolved should both parties agree in good faith to the initial terms. I read the words as if they were on someone else's page. The trust was a promise that betrayed the nature of promises. It was both protection and prison. The language was careful. It said things like for the welfare of the minor and for the continuing education of the child. It did not say that my autonomy had a cost attached to it. When I confronted Alexander wood by wood, ink by inky, listened with that patient face that had already learned the weather of my emotions. You are a student, he said, as if I had declared a fact nobody had noticed. You must finish. He folded his hands and let the sentence hang there. It was one of the first times I saw him not as a threat but as someone who could allocate resources. In a way, my life's arithmetic had lacked. I will not sign anything without understanding it, I said. That sounded true even to me. I asked the questions aloud that sent Melanie into a protective fury when I detailed them on the phone. Who will make decisions? Can I take Lily out of the country? What about her apartment? The bank accounts? He listened and answered in a manner that made legalities feel like furniture you could rearrange, solid and movable. I will ensure Lily's routine is not disrupted, he promised. School, tutors, stability. You will continue your studies. I will fund tuition. You will have your own space. There was an insistence in his voice that made me wonder whether he had rehearsed the role of benefactor more than the part of spouse. There was always the hum beneath control, shaped as care. He suggested, gently, that moving forward would be easier if we agreed to a few safeguards. A security detail for the house. A GPS tracker for the car. I felt the edges of every suggestion, like fingers pressing into my wrist. They were offered as protection. They felt like shackles. You can refuse, he said once, watching me watch the words on a page. You can go away with money and no contact. You can insist I pay for you without being part of our household. The offer was a mirror of the cathedral. Freedom framed by options I had not sought. The man who had the capacity to harm in vaguely stated ways had again laid out choices as if they were a menu. Take custody of your life with resources, he might have been saying, or accept the terms that keep you close and visible. It was an uglier sort of kindness than I deserved, and a protection that would always be I thought of Lily, how she pronounced university in the way only 5-year-olds could, and how the thought of her attending a good school without fear felt like oxygen. I thought of Melanie, and how she would light up with relief if someone else paid tuition bills for the rest of the detriddled semester. I need time, I told him. It was true, as far as I could see. Time is a shape you can use to make decisions less sharp. He nodded, an economical motion. Time was something he did not waste. Days folded into a strange kind of routine. Tutors arrived. A car took Lily to a preschool that smelled fabulously of finger paint and the easy laughter of children. I signed forms that meant less than they felt and more than I wanted them to. There were dinners where conversation orbited around sanitized topics, literature, the merits of certain schools, while beneath it a current of power moved with a quiet, precise rhythm. Melanie called every evening. Her voice was a rope thrown between two cliffs. She wanted me to run. She wanted me to take Lily and return to whatever precarious but honest life we had before. He's dangerous, she said, tonally all caps. He is dangerous, and you're not bargaining with a kindly philanthropist. I would find myself answering in fragments, because the truth had a dozen edges and I did not want to send any of them off for her. He's offering school for Lily, I would say. He's paying my tuition. He brings her tea in the mornings. You think that's kindness? She asked. Her incredulity was the only honest sound I would receive those nights. You think he'll stop at school? There were other nights when I would catch Alexander watching Lily as she arranged dolls on the carpet, her language looping into stories about the daughter she would be. He would stand at the doorway, hands in pockets, the body of a man who had learned to take things and sometimes to care for the things he took. He would kneel, carefully, the way a man removes shoes that have learned the weight of long travel, and tied the ribbon in Lily's hair. He would listen to the stories she made up about the purple castle and the dragon with a toothache, and then without fanfare he would take her hand and lead her to the window to show her how the rain made the magnolia leaves stand up like sentinels. Those moments were small and humiliating in equal measure. He kissed the top of her head in public. He apologized for it later to me, as though sanctity could be sorted by a private remorse. He apologized for having men in the house like they were a blight. His soldiers were his habit, he said, like a man who collects artifacts from a life almost impossible to stage. I resented him for the ways he made life comfortable. Comfort became a slow furnace that softened me where I had thought myself ironclad. I resented him for the tuition paid in cash, in bonds, in scripted trust accounts. But I also watched Lily sleep and saw no shadows at the edges of her dreams. No one lurked in the corners of her nights. She dreamed of purple castles and toothache dragons and the new friend her mother had called Mr. Alexander on an early morning. One morning, weeks after the wedding that should never have occurred, Mr. Harrington arrived in person. If Alexander carried an aura, Mr. Harrington was its paperwork. He was a man in a suit that fit as if he were stitched out of law and appointment. He brought a folder that smelled faintly of new paper and certainty. He sat across from me and splayed documents like someone demonstrating how a chessboard reads. We will discuss the parameters of the provisional trust, he said. The words clinical and precise. We can tailor visitation, travel restrictions, and the allocation of funds. All intended, of course, for the minors' well-being. You mean your client's well-being under the guise of the minors? I asked too, sharply. Mr. Harrington did not flinch. Ms. Lassen, Mr. Volkov's priority is the stability of the child. Funds will be available immediately for tuition, housing, medical. Signatures will be necessary to enact immediate transfers. All funds will be placed in a trust controlled by a third-party trustee until both parties agree to a permanent arrangement. The phrase third-party trustee sounded like a promise wrapped in an echo of something I could not touch. My hands hovered over the paper. I imagined a future where every expense for Lily was vetted by a voice that was not mine. You will retain maternal decision-making, he said, tactically. We aim to preserve the child's relationship with her mother while minimizing exposure to undue influence. I wanted to believe him. I wanted with all the marrow I had left, to believe that my choice, if I could call what I had been given a choice, would be preserved in a way that would not reduce me to a signature on a ledger. I wanted to believe that protections bore no deeper cost, but the cost was everywhere. It sat on the edge of the papers, in the fine print, in the way Alexander's men hovered in the wings of every sentence. When I left the room that afternoon, the weight of those documents made my bag feel like a briefcase of iron. Lily met me at the door with a drawing of a house with purple shutters. "It's our castle," she announced. Proud and final. I felt a small, fierce surge of gratitude and shame. Gratitude, because she was safe. Shame, because safety had come spliced with clauses. That night, Alexander knocked on my door softly, something in the rhythm that said he had been taught to be gentle with things one might break. "Do not allow them to make you feel small," he said. When I looked up, he added, quietly, "You will have the university you want? You will have your own space. We will negotiate in ways that do not humiliate you." "Isn't that what this whole thing is?" I said, heartbeat loud in my throat. "A negotiation." He did not answer directly. "I am not trying to erase what happened," he said instead. "I am trying to make sure the consequences do not spread like an infection to those who were not involved." "I did not ask for this," I said, the sentence both blunt and raw. It was not a plea, it was an inventory. "I know," he said, and the plainness of the words felt like two people standing in a doorway with a list of damages between them. He left a cup of tea for me, and, for the first time, a small stack of books on philosophy and literature titles chosen, he explained, because they were good companions for a student. Small, curated kindnesses that felt both purchased and real. There were nights when I dreamed of running, of calling Melanie's bluff, and opening the door to the life we had before. There were other nights when I lay awake and thought through the math. Tuition, security, a safe life for Lily. The ledger of choices had a bottom line that did not account for the quiet erosion of autonomy, of the slow accretion of favors that gave and took in equal measure. Weeks passed. I attended lectures on campus with my bag, scanning articles like a woman holding a secret. I wore clothes I had bought from a store that smelled like new money and felt like theft. Tutors came in the afternoons. Lily leaned over the same alphabet and learned to write the curlicue of an A with a proud, blunt pencil. The calendar was crowded with appointments that promised normalcy. Melanie would come by sometimes and pace on the manicured lawn like an accused spirit. "You have to get your custody rights ironed out," she said one afternoon, the way one might insist on the lining of a coat. "I'm trying," I said. "I'm trying to finish a paper." "You're not trying to be okay, Em." She said it like a verdict. There was a line in the days where my life cleaved so cleanly it hurt. People called with condolences that felt like thin veils for curiosity. I answered with patience that made my bones weary. I did the things a mother does to keep her child's small orbit stable. I understood, with a clarity that made me ache, that some bargains are struck in the places where we are most vulnerable. The house hummed with quiet efficiency. The staff moved like a carefully choreographed ensemble. Lily came home from preschool with new words and dirt under her nails. I watched her learn to navigate a life that was suddenly gilded at the edges. I watched Alexander navigate his role as both the man who made the bargain and the man who put the bandages on its wound. One evening, as I sat at the small desk that had become mine, papers spread around like the pieces of a life I was trying to assemble. A knock sounded. Mr. Harrington came in with a half smile and a folder I had seen before. "There are some routine amendments," he said. "We need to clarify travel permissions and parental decision-making protocols." "You mean you want to be able to take her out of the country without my consent?" I said before I could stop myself. The words were more blunt than I felt. He folded his hands. "It is standard to require mutual consent for international travel involving a minor. Mr. Vo suggests exceptions in situations of family emergency. Of course, we will institute checks to ensure no single party can unilaterally remove the child from jurisdiction." The wording was careful enough to make the motion of control invisible. I closed the folder. There was a part of me that wanted to tear everything into confetti and let the lawyer sweep it away. There was another part that had learned to count pennies and knew how long it would take me to secure a mortgage by myself for to pay for 4 years of a university education without bulk transfers from men whose names were not mine. "You're telling me how to parent my child," I said, by putting clauses around my decisions. Mr. Harrington inhaled and exhaled the way someone trained to hold a room steady does. "Ms. Lawson, these measures are to protect the child from undue influence. You cannot legislate love," I answered, which made no sense in the sterile legal air of the room. "You can't create trust with clauses." His smile did not crack. "We're not attempting to legislate trust. We're safeguarding stability." I thought of Lily drawing purple castles in her coloring book, and of a world in which a child's sleep should not be guarded by men in suits and coats. I thought of Greg and the faint, absurd wish that he might return and apologize for the chances he had taken, for reasons I would probably never understand. I didn't sign the amendments that day. I took the folder home and put it in my drawer next to the receipt for the last tuition deposit I'd ever have to make had I accepted everything. I ate dinner with Lily and watched her play with her dolls and tried to remember the texture of a life that had once belonged only to me. At night, I would walk the corridors and hear the muffled sound of the city beyond the high hedges. Alexander would sometimes be at his desk with a cigarette, the kind you see in movies, the slow, theatrical condensed blue of cathode lights around him, as if he were a soul lit by different sunlight. He would glance up and say, simply, "You should sleep, you should walk away." I would say sometimes, half in jest, half in longing. He never answered that way. He would say instead, "We will continue negotiating." For Lily, the sentence sat like a pact, for protective, possessive, apologetic. Lily was at the center, and the shape of the sentence bent like iron under heat. One afternoon, months after the wedding that had redefined the geometry of my life, I received an acceptance email for a research fellowship at the university. It arrived like a small victory, wrapped in the weight of all that had happened. The program would require me to travel for a semester to conduct fieldwork in a city 3 hours away. It was the sort of opportunity I had imagined when I studied the margins of text and the way narratives make sense. When I told Alexander, he listened. "We will make arrangements," he said. "The tutors can travel with her. The security team can facilitate." I saw then the shape of what might be negotiated into a life that did not feel like a gilded cage. I also saw the specter of being escorted to lectures, of decisions fenced by men who measured risk with a ruler that was not mine. I stood at a threshold between leaving for a research opportunity that might define my career and staying in a house where my daughter's safety seemed guaranteed, but my autonomy compromised. I had learned to translate violence and threat into terms that could be negotiated. I had learned to bargain with men who spoke in the currency of fear and favors. I understood now that protection could be a frame for ownership. That evening, Alexander left a letter on my table. It was short. "Choose what will be best for her," it read. The phrase was less a release than a test. The house felt suddenly smaller, like a room you discovered had no doors, only promises with hinges. I thought of the cathedral, the bells that accused me, the congregation that watched me sign my consent to another life. I thought of Greg, and how his absence made space for someone else to step forward. A man who could erase a debt with a signature and create obligations with a softer hand. I held Lily while she slept, her small cheek warm and untroubled. I understood, in a way that made my ribs ache, that all choices had costs. The bargain had been struck to prevent harm. It had bought safety in installments. It had also placed me in a position where every small kindness carved away at an old autonomy. When morning came, Mr. Harrington called to schedule a meeting to finalize the provisional guardianship for Lily during my fellowship term. The call was brisk, efficient. He proposed terms that would ensure uninterrupted schooling and a clear line for medical decisions. He used phrases like best interest and institutional continuity. I folded the phone into my palm and rested my forehead against it. I had a choice to make. Not the kind you imagined when you dream of freedom, but a narrower, truer kind. The decision to accept a life eased by someone else's resources and shaped by his conditions, or to cut that line and face the unknown without the scaffolding of wealth and security. The documents waited like a patient litany on my kitchen table, each page a small door. I could sign and guarantee the next years of Lily's childhood. I could demand different terms and risk changing the tenor of protection into something less secure. There was also the possibility thin and dangerous that I could refuse and walk away with enough money to buy time, but not the certainty of safety. I picked up a pen and set it down again. The air in the room felt like the brief moment before a storm breaks. Even the furniture seemed to hold its breath. Outside, somewhere beyond the hedges that kept the world at bay, the city continued, unaware of the way a single act in a cathedral had reconfigured 3 lives. I felt the weight of that title, how a groom's rejection had led me into a bargain with a man whose name I had only whispered a few months before, and realized that the transaction was not over. Choices would come like waves, each one demanding a different kind of courage. The meeting with Mr. Harrington was scheduled for the next morning. The papers needed answers. Lily, oblivious and brimming with trust, practiced her spelling for school. I watched her and felt the gravity of what I must decide. And for the first time in months, the decision felt less like surrender and more like something I might, in the end, steer. I opened the folder and began to read. The words were ordinary in type but extraordinary in consequence. Clauses folded like wings across the page. Each sentence was a small architecture of power. Who decided? Who paid? Who could move what a child needed? I read them once, then again, watching my name in the margins, as if it were something separate from the woman who had to sign them. It was the peculiar business of being counted, my life itemized into terms that smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. Mr. Harrington arrived the next morning with coffee, the way a surgeon comes with instruments. He had the same calm that made the room feel smaller. Men like him carried steadiness as if it were oxygen. He set the folder down, looked at me, and said, "There are options." Option framed the world like a store with reasonable shelves. I wanted to throw the shelves into the street. We walked through the provisional guardianship item by item. He spoke in the language of risk mitigation, third-party trustee, mutual consent for international travel, immediate transfers for educational expenses. I asked questions that felt plain to me. Who would sign for medical procedures? What constituted an emergency? How would tutors be contracted? Who would have access to account statements? For each practical question I posed, there was a legalese answer that either soothed or sharpened. The more practical I tried to be, the more the room constricted with the realities of the bargain. "Will I have final say in day-to-day parenting?" I asked. "You will retain maternal decision-making," Mr. Harrington said. The phrase was careful as glass, and I held it like something fragile. "But we recommend clear procedures for crisis situations. We will define crisis in the appendix," I said. It felt petty and urgent to reduce moral authority to a definition, but sometimes the smallest things are the hinges of a house. He noted it. Alexander's assistant Nadia hovered outside the doorway like a librarian who guarded certain volumes. She carried a tablet and a pen as if she were the real scribe of the exchange. When I left the meeting, the documents tucked under my arm felt less like paper and more like a map I had not agreed to follow. The house itself seemed to notice the change. Dmitri, the broad-shouldered man, who moved in the corners of rooms, waited at the foot of the stair and nodded with the kind of professional politeness men who guard empires extend to. People whose lives are worth watching. "You did good," he said to Lily when she ran ahead of me. He spoke to her with a gentleness that made my skin tighten. It was the sound of a soldier explaining simple directions to a child. Lily grinned and handed him a drawing of him as a knight with a purple helmet. Dmitri took it seriously and placed it on the mantelpiece like a medal. In the weeks that followed, the practicalities of our life reorganized themselves into a new grammar. Tutors arrived in a smiling rotation. They taught Lily to write her name with a brisk, patient repetition that made it look like a spell. Alexander arranged for me to meet with a faculty member who became my mentor. She helped me understand how to shape my fellowship into something more than a promise. I went back to the library and felt the swell of words that had always buoyed me. The sort of rescue that doesn't arrive with a ledger. There were rituals that read less like kindness than calculation. The GPS in my car, a slim device taped under the dashboard, and explained to me as if it were a map to avoid getting lost. The security briefings. The men who smelled faintly of cologne and polish, waiting in the driveway like a polite fog. Each one was presented as protection, not possession. But the way they settled into my life made me feel continually measured. "It's for Lily," Alexander would say when I pushed back. He said it with a softness that sometimes made my chest tilt toward him and sometimes made my jaw set. Protective language has a lullaby quality. It calms the body while remaking the mind. I learned to live with the small humiliations. I signed for tutors who could have been hired by a wealthy benefactor and yet still felt like foreign currency. I let a nanny quiet, efficient, with a careful way of smoothing Lily's hair build, a rhythm for our mornings. I took classes and answered questions about research design while watching the sunlight hit the magnolia outside my window and thinking about consent as a shape, as something you had to hold and negotiate. There were confrontations, too sharp, necessary ones. Melanie accused and then begged. She moved through the house as if she were trying on room after room to see which one still fit her rage. "He used you," she would say. When I tried to tell her the small ways in which the house had become bearable, "He used you to buy stability." "You sound like a scar," I answered one afternoon, closing the door softly to keep her anger from reaching Lily. "Are you asking me to choose between being a mother and having safety for my child?" Melanie pressed her fingertips to the table, as if she wanted to steady herself on material things. "I'm asking you to live without someone's ledger deciding your life," she said. "He can help. He shouldn't own the terms." Her words stayed with me like a thesis I had to disprove or prove. They buzzed under the quiet domestic hum, the way a fly would buzz under glass. Later, when Lily slept, I would sit with those words and draft answers that kept changing. There was a particular evening I remember because it cracked an arrangement like a thin glass turned over. A journalist called. The voice on the other end was careful, professional, smelling faintly of curiosity and danger. "We've heard rumors about the wedding," she said. "About Mr. Volkov's involvement. Would you comment?" I felt the color leave the picture frames on my walls. The house has its own privacy, but walls do not stop microphones. Alexander sat on the far side of the room, a presence that felt like published ink, visible, legible, imposing. He listened as I spoke to the journalist in two Chango sentences, trying to control the narrative without making a spectacle. "People will say what people say," he told me afterward, "but we will not be hamstrung by their speculation." "We don't need protection from words," I said, hot with a thought I had not allowed before. "We need the choice to live our lives without being reduced to headlines about bargains. My daughter deserves that." He leaned forward, palms flat on his knees, the outline of a man who could command a room but also someone who could fold into the smallness of a corner. "Then sign the non-disclosure," he said slowly. "We will pay for counsel. We will make words not matter." "No," I said. The word, bare and decisive, surprised me with its sound. "I will not be muzzled because someone else behaves badly." He studied me for a long moment, and in that moment there was something like recognition, or perhaps surprise. "You are not as easy as you looked at the altar," he said, with a dry humor that had no warmth. And then, with a different tone one, of admission he added, "I did not expect to find someone who refused the very thing I'm offering." The refusal was small, a chink in a larger architecture. When I refused, paparazzi interest cooled not because my defiance was noble, but because the story's edges dulled. Scandal needs pleasure to survive. Still, on the nights when the cameras were gone and the house grew itself into shadows, the absence of a certain kind of notice felt like air. Development came in Lily's teachers wrote notes about her steady attention. My mentor recommended a reading list that made my chest ache with possibility. Alexander surprised me with a library card that unlocked a private library in the wing I had not yet been allowed to wander. Its shelves smelled of dust and binding glue, of books that had waited long enough for someone to notice them. He watched me as if he were marking how the world had opened on the notes of my life. One afternoon, when a rain came soft and slow like someone turning a page, I found him in that private library, equally absorbed in a volume of essays I had loved since college. There was a tenderness in his focus, as though he were learning how to be quiet in a room full of words that had previously meant nothing to him. "You read it," he said without looking up, pronouncing the name with that precise accent of his. It was not a question, it was recognition. "I taught a class on political theory for a term," I admitted, feeling a pride that had nothing to do with him. "It's what I study." He closed the book and turned toward me, his features soft by indoor light. "You are not just a ledger to me," he said. "If I gave you money and then took away this," he gestured vaguely at the shelves, "then I would have paid for silence, not for you." His words were complicated. They were an apology and an argument at once. I wanted to accept the candor and also wanted to push back on the quiet justification that had once been the basis of all his interventions. "Make me whole without erasing me," I replied. He did not answer in that moment, but later, in small and steady ways, he began to show the intention of the sentence. He arranged for me to attend a lecture series abroad, insisted that tutors travel with Lily, and most importantly, began to dismantle certain measures in practice. Dmitri steps back during parent-teacher conferences. Nadia would hand me an itinerary and then close the file and let me speak to the staff without a mediator. The tracker in my car was reprogrammed so that it pinged only to an emergency line rather than a constant location feed. It was not the removal of all watchfulness, but it was a step. Yet, even as he loosened one knot, another tightened. There were nights when the house hummed with men moving through like instruments I could hear but could not name. There were dinners in which the staff clustered like a chorus we were obliged to perform for. I resented those rituals when they appeared. I also felt the weight of small mercies. Lily's inoculations were never missed. Her dental visits were scheduled in a chair that made her giggle. I could buy a coffee without counting pennies. The ledger had both credit and debit. Months condensed into a pattern that felt both ordinary and impossible. Lily flourished in small ways. She learned to whistle. She insisted soups be labeled with stickers she had decorated. She organized a royal tea for Mrs. Reynolds and Nate, the young tutor, who wore a crooked smile as he taught her fractions. She began to call Alexander by a name she chose, Mr. Alex, a compromise that felt tender and not threatening. The word warmed him in a way I had not expected to enjoy watching. One morning, a letter came that changed the geometry of our arrangement. It was from the fellowship committee. They accepted my proposal to conduct fieldwork for the semester. The city was 3 hours away by train. The fellowship required relocation for a stretch of months and significant independence of movement, something I had not tasted since the Cathedral. The acceptance arrived like a tidal shift, an invitation I had worked toward for years, and a test of whether my life could hold it. When I told Alexander, he listened as if he were cataloging the next point in a complex ledger. "We can facilitate," he said, "the habitual offer. The team will travel. Tutors will be arranged. Medical contingencies planned." But then, when I asked whether the house would truly give me the kind of freedom the fellowship required, he surprised me. "You'll want to go without an entourage," I said. "I don't want a team of men following me into a train station because that's not living." He watched me for a long moment. "If you take this fellowship," he said finally, "I will remove the surveillance measures I can remove. But you must understand that I will still ensure Lily's stability. If you want to take more risk with fewer protections for her, that's a conversation we can have." He spelled it as a choice, and it landed between us like an object that required inspection. It was, again, the same offer presented in a different tone. Live with close watch and certain safety for Lily, or demand greater autonomy for yourself and accept different arrangements for her care that might feel less secure. "I want to go," I said. The sentence was light and heavy all at once. "Then go," he replied. "And when you leave, I will ask that you sign a limited power of attorney for necessary medical decisions so tutors can act in emergencies. But I will remove trackers and reduce bodyguard presence." It was more than he had offered before. It was less than absolute freedom, but it felt like a gesture that acknowledged my agency and honored it by stepping back. I accepted the fellowship. Packing for that month felt like folding distance between who I had been and who I might become. Mr. Harrington drew up limited consents. Nadia organized the logistics and then handed me a ticket, a small piece of paper that felt like a talisman. The morning I left, Lily clung to my coat with the kind of fierce, single-minded attachment only a 5-year-old could produce. Bring home a story, she told me in the doorway. You bring home too, I promised. The line was a vow and a bargaining chip. The fieldwork was everything it promised. Lectures, dusty archives, nights in a thin hotel bed, while I wrote notes that felt like resurrection. I ate bad coffee, in the company of other academics who spoke in enthusiasms and footnotes. I was, for the first time in a long string of months, the woman who did not have to look out for exits or calculate who could be hurt by my moves. It was a gift and a test. During my absence, I called every evening. Lily adapted in ways that proud mothers sometimes do not accept. She learned that absence could be managed with video chats and colored envelopes full of stickers. The tutors sent me videos of her practicing letters and making crescents out of dough for a pretend bakery. The house, for its part, hummed along like a well-oiled engine. The men who guarded it respected the provisos of the limited consent. Dmitri sent me a photograph of Lily with a flour-smeared apron and a note that read, simply, Princess of the Purple Oven. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was a change in the house's atmosphere. There was less of a sentinel quality to it. Rooms felt airier, less heavily watched. Mr. Harrington had redrawn some lines in practice. Alexander himself greeted me in the foyer, as if we were roommates who had been politely separated for a time rather than a pair connected by ledger. He handed me a small book I had mentioned months earlier. A first edition of essays, its spine soft from being read. You were right to leave, he said, acknowledging both the time and its import. You needed to be the woman you are without me as a margin. His words sounded like an apology and an admission both. He did not ask for repayment. He merely placed the book in my hands and stepped back. There were tensions, of course. Not all the staff adjusted well to the idea of a woman who could cross a half-country for research. There were whispered conversations about how to protect the child and how to preserve a man's honor. I sat at the kitchen table one night, Mrs. Reynolds ironing napkins like someone who thought the world could be smoothed with starch, and I realized that protection is a social habit as much as it is a practical arrangement. You can be a mother and a scholar, Mrs. Reynolds told me one evening, looking up from her ironing with the kind of steady knowledge that comes from having folded more lives than your own. You will have to decide how loud you want to be about it. Her advice was plain. Live loudly enough to be heard, but softly enough to preserve the child's tidy edges. It was not a bad summary of the life I had inherited and chosen to shape. The turning point came quietly, like a door opening in a windless room. It was not a revelation, so much as a set of small motions converging into an honest offer. Alexander called a meeting and invited Mr. Harrington and Nadia. He asked me to join him in the study, a room I had watched from the periphery for months, filled with maps and old portraits that seemed to watch our conversation like witnesses. You've done well, he began, a phrase that felt like both praise and accounting. He sat behind his desk, not the desk as a throne, but as a place where decisions could be made with less theater. Nadia closed the door and left us a private space. I want to make an offer, he said. The words were simple. He looked unusually uncertain. The man who had once leaned across an altar with calm authority now seemed less sure of how to phrase a possibility. You offered me choices before, I said. They were always shaped by what you wanted. I need something else. A choice that is truly mine. He nodded. I can offer you two paths, he said. One, we formalize a separation of obligations. I will place a transfer in an irrevocable trust for Lily's education and well-being, with an independent trustee who will report to you. You'll have funds and security forever tied to her needs. You can take the money, leave this household, and raise Lily without surveillance, without men in the background. You will retain visitation and support. There will be no contact unless you want it. The first option was as clear as a ledger entry. It was what my sister had urged me to seek, freedom with security. I imagined a life of practical independence, a house small and honest, and maybe a little thin for money, but one I would own without the weight of a man's staff at the gate. An option two? I asked. Two, he said, and there was a long pause as if the word had to be reshaped twice before being offered. Is that you stay? But you stay as an equal partner, not as someone who signed away her life under duress. I will remove surveillance thoroughly. I will restructure the trust so that it is governed by decisions you can participate in. I will give you a seat at the table in legal matters concerning Lily. I will take responsibility for the initial harm, the duress, and we will a public statement acknowledging that the choice at the altar was made under coercion. We will set up binding commitments to respect your autonomy. We will not be the kind of household where your choices are measured by what I allow. He stopped. In his face, I saw both calculation and an offering that looked like contrition. It was the first time he had attempted to name the original wrongdoing in a way that felt like acknowledgement rather than a footnote. You're offering me consent, I said, on your terms. The bitterness in that sentence made the air between us thin. I am offering you agency, he corrected. If you want to leave, I will not hinder you. If you want to stay, I will negotiate with the institutions that hold the money to rewrite the structure so you have real authority. You will sign nothing under duress. I will step back where you say I should. It was, in practical terms, the most radical thing he had done yet. He moved from being the man who had offered protection as a purchase to someone admitting the moral wrongness of how that protection began. You understand what you are asking, I said. If I choose to stay, people will say I stayed because I wanted to. They will not see the ledger that started it. And they should not have to see, he replied. But you deserve the truth being told, even if no one listens. The offer laid everything out, 2 different kinds of freedom, both imperfect in their own way. Leaving with a financial lifeboat and a life to rebuild, or staying in a household transformed into something she could help govern. I asked for time to think. It felt reasonable, like a snap of air after a breath held too long. He gave it. He did not move to influence me. Nadia sent me a schedule of options and left me small margins of silence that I had not expected from the house that had once been all insistence. I called Melanie. She was a miasma of hope and dread, reading the options the way a jury reads evidence. Take the money and go, she insisted, in the soft shriek of a woman who has risked heartache for courage before. Take it and live. Men like him don't change. I listened because it was my sister, and because she had been right about other things. I weighed her opinion like a scale. Safety for Lily versus the cost of being owned in polite clothes. I thought of Lily, and of how she called Alexander Mr. Alex with the kind of endearment that was both a child's refusal to notice awkwardness and an adaptation to a new reality. I thought of Lily learning in a house where men watched the exits and tutors arrive like rotating satellites. I thought of the purple canopy over a bed where a child dreamed of dragons with toothaches. I thought of the nights when I had been a single mother making choices on the thin currency of an overtime shift, and the nights when I had felt the relief of having a tuition paid without a month-by-month accounting. I thought of myself, not the ledger, not the signature, but the person who loved literature, who had taught, who had waited on buses with a child on her lap and a heart full of patience. I imagined a life where I could keep that woman and also secure a future for Lily. In the end, the decision was not clean. It was not a heroic arc. I did not meet a noble go-between who untied the knot with a flourish. I walked across the corridor that divided the wing of my room from his study and pressed my hand against the wood. The door was a threshold I had crossed in 1,000 small ways, a corridor of pauses and arguments and negotiations, and now it held the weight of a real question. Who would I be if I stepped through? I knocked, and he answered without surprise. His face, when the door opened, was an open ledger, lines and notations written as a map. You have your answer? He asked. I do, I said. We sat and spoke for a long time. Not the flirtation of 2 people falling in a story, but the slow, necessary conversation of adults making a contract with each other not only in law but in principle. I told him what would matter to me. Absolute removal of trackers and non-essential guards. A restructuring of the trust with a reputable independent trustee chosen by me. Formal acknowledgement of duress and a public document to that effect, and a binding agreement that any major decisions about Lily would involve my equal consent. I asked for guarantees that I would be free to leave the house for any reason without prior approval, and that my study and schedules would be respected. He listened without interrupting, as if my list were a surgical incision he had to allow without intervention. At the end he said, quietly. I can give you all that. There was a pause, heavy with the past. What will it cost you? I asked, because I needed to know whether the price would be measures that might later sting like regret. I will lose control, he said without artifice. I will yield authority I am used to. I will have to publicize my own wrongdoing as a fact and accept the reputational consequences. I will have to let you step away if you want, with the trust untouched. I will not have the convenience of power I had earlier. His admission sounded honest in the way real confessions often do, flat and vulnerable. That is not a small ask, I said. No, he said. It is not. We spent the afternoon shaping the contours of what equality might look like. Mr. Harrington rewrote documents. Nadia handled the logistics, and Dmitri, who had stood at entrances for months, found his role, recast as a guardian who respected boundaries rather than enforced proximity. He looked at me once and said, simply, if she wants to cross the street alone, Ms. Loss, she will. His voice held a respect that felt like new wood being hewn. When everything was written down, and the papers lay between us like shreds of history made tidy, I picked up a pen. I had thought for months that signing was a threshold that took things from me. This time, the pen felt less like surrender and more like choosing which house to build with the materials around me. I signed the document that made the trust irrevocable, and under the oversight of an independent trustee, I had approved. I signed the acknowledgement that my first marriage had been made under duress and that it would be publicly recognized. I signed the clause that removed non-essential surveillance. Alexander signed his part, agreeing to the structural changes and to cede certain authorities he had once regarded as his, by instinct. There were witnesses, and then there was a silence, the length of something being born. The air in the room felt different because it tasted of truth rather than arrangement. It did not make past harm vanish. It did not pretend the cathedral had never happened. It only made it possible for me to move forward with a negotiating table that now had 2 seats of equal height. That night, when Lily had been tucked in with a new storybook and Mrs. Reynolds had turned down the lights, Alexander came to my door. He looked at me, not like a man who had bought my consent, but like someone who had been chastened by what he had done and was trying to be trusted anew. "Will you sit?" he asked. I sat. We did not rush into some grand romance. We sat, and the seconds we shared were small things. A conversation about a line from Hemingway he had read awkwardly but thoughtfully. A reluctant laugh over the ridiculous formality of legalese. A confession from him about an old fear he had of being powerless. The more he let me see his edges, the ways he defended, and the ways he regretted the defense, the less I saw him as simply a figure of menace. He was someone complex, marred by choices I could not absolve, capable of tenderness that had once been entangled with possession. When he reached for my hand, it was not with ownership but with inquiry. "Can I," he asked, "be allowed to show you who I am without you feeling obliged?" "Yes," I said. The answer was not a surrender but a permission I gave him and myself. It was a small, radical act. Consent given after harm acknowledged and boundaries set. We kissed, then gently, like 2 adults testing a new arrangement. It was not the kind of cinematic surrender that erases moral complexity. It was a careful, consensual closeness that arrived after difficult conversations and legal forms. Later, when Lily wandered into the hall with a stuffed rabbit in hand, asking for one more bedtime story, we laughed together to make her think the world had always been like this, partly because she could not carry complexity, and partly because it felt good to share a laugh without the ledger between us. The months that followed were not a fairy tale. There were moments when I woke in the dark, with the sound of cathedral bells still in my chest. There were nights when headlines tried to rewrite our story into simpler parts. But the house had shifted. The staff learned new rules. Mr. Harrington became a kind of covenant keeper who balanced the books, with a new level of respect for my role. Nadia handled schedules, and then stepped back when I wanted privacy. Dmitri, who had once been an imposing presence at all exits, became a figure who closed doors and stood respectfully out of sight. His transformation was small but meaningful. Protection became service rather than permanent surveillance. Lily grew, as children do, in ways that surprised a parent. She learned to divide her heart between a mother who worked at a desk and a man who would kneel to tie a ribbon. She held on to the purple canopy and the weekly tea parties she insisted upon. And she created new rituals that included both of us. Cake on Tuesday, story time on Thursdays. She started to ask complicated questions. Why did Daddy go away? When will Auntie Mags visit? And I answered them in language she could hold. I told her the truth about choices and protection in small pieces she could digest. Sometimes people make bargains to keep others safe. Sometimes people realize those bargains were wrong, and then we fix what we can. She accepted the pieces she could, as children often do, content to collect sticker prizes and small triumphs. There were hard conversations with Melanie. She, stubborn and fierce, softened when she saw the way the house had changed. She accepted dinners with us without folding into accusatory silence. It was not reconciliation as television writes it. It was the more interesting thing. Family, learning new boundaries. Rachel visited more often, and her friendship became an anchor, someone who remembered the woman I had been before the cathedral and cheered the woman I was becoming. One evening, years removed enough that the word years did not feel too large, I made a habit of walking past the altar room in my mind like a museum piece, reverent but distanced. The cathedral bells did not accuse me any more. They were only bells, and time had hollowed away some of their sharpness. Alexander and I had conversations about power and where it belongs. Sometimes we argued, and sometimes we listened. Sometimes he faltered and reached for the man he used to be, possessive, authoritative, afraid of losing an arrangement that had worked for him. Other times, he stepped into the more difficult mode of being accountable, letting me speak first, and choosing his actions by the terms we had set. Agency, I learned, is not a single act, but 1,000 small decisions taken over time. There were days when I chose to be angry and others where I chose to accept a kindness and then convert it into something else. I learned the real currency of power, the ability to make decisions about one's life without coercion, the right to voice contrary opinions and have them respected rather than catalogued. It was not an easy life, but it was more honest. On the anniversary of the wedding that had made the bargain, I found myself in the room that had once been a stage. Lily had arranged a tea party on the floor with 3 stuffed animals and a crown she had made from paper. "This is to celebrate when you put your hand in his hand," she announced, solemn as a judge. I looked at Alexander and then at my child, feeling the complicated warmth of a life that had been remade. We had not erased harm. We had not turned coercion into a romantic origin story glossed in roses. Instead, we had done the harder work, acknowledged the wrongdoing, made structural changes, and then chose, and on terms that protected my autonomy, to build something that was imperfect, but ultimately chosen. I am a mother first, and that remains the axis of my life. Every decision I make is weighted by the light in Lily's sleep and the way she pronounces university, like a promise. But I am also a woman with a voice and a profession and a body of choices that I demanded and, in small ways, When people ask now, in quieter tones sometimes, "Why did you stay?" I tell them the truth in the only words that matter. Staying was not a surrender, but a decision. It was a choice I made after I had the facts. After the man who had once offered a bargain at the altar conceded the wrongness of his method and was willing to relinquish the conveniences of power for the harder work of becoming someone I could trust on different terms. We do not live in a storybook. Alex remains a man whose life is tangled in things that frighten me. He has enemies I will never fully know, and systems I cannot entirely understand. But he also has learned to be accountable in a way that matters, legally, structurally, and in daily practice. The house is not as silent as it once was, when men patrolled its halls. Laughter comes more often than the hush of reverence. The title that once defined the beginning of our story, The Groom's Rejection, led to an unthinkable deal with the Mafia boss was accurate as an inciting event. The public humiliation at the cathedral did indeed lead to the bargain that changed our lives, but it did not define the end. It was the first painful notes in a long composition, one that required center stage negotiations, public acknowledgments of wrongdoing, legal restructuring, and the daily labor of trust building to move towards something resembling partnership. If you have followed me this far, you know the ledger and the life it mapped. You have seen that bargains struck under pressure do not make tidy moral tallies. They leave marks on you and on the people you love. They require courage to unravel and to recraft into something that honors the autonomy of those who were forced to choose. They require truth-telling and, sometimes, the willingness of the person who wielded power to give it up. Tonight, Lily will curl her hair into a ribbon and pronounce a new story into the dark. Alexander will tuck her in without fanfare, and I will stand in the doorway and watch. Not as a woman who had her life purchased, but as one who had to bargain for safety and then fought to make the terms just. I will read to her about explorers and scholars and women who walked strange coastlines and came back with new maps. My hand will rest on the copy of essays he once gave me. It will be a small thing among many in a house that has learned to hold contradictions. There will be no triumphant anthem. There will be, instead, a fragile, careful piece made of daily choices. I will keep choosing for my child and for myself. If Emma's Choice surprised you, like and subscribe for more stories about impossible bargains and hard choices.